So just to officially welcome everybody to week 5 of the Cecil Gibb Research Seminar Series. I'll do the usual housekeeping etiquette before we get started. So just a reminder to everyone that this is being recorded and it will be available on the Psychology YouTube playlist when it's done. Upon entry to the seminar, you've been muted. We ask you stay muted for the duration of the seminar. We will have a question time at the end of the seminar. If you have a question, you can pop it in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand at the end and we will unmute you. So now I will hand over to Kate to introduce our fabulous speaker for today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Erin. So I'd like to start just by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're each meeting on, wherever we might be, and pay our respects to leaders past, present and emerging. And of course, we extend that respect to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders here today. I'd like to welcome Orla Muldoon. It's the start of the day for you, Orla, and it's sort of towards the end of the day for us. Thank you for joining us for our research seminar and presenting for us today. For those of you who don't know Orla, she completed her PhD at Queen's University in Belfast and has held a number of academic positions in Ireland and is now at the University of Limerick. She's served there as the head of school, and she's currently also the editor of the journal Political Psychology, where quite a few of us in the social psychology group have published our work. Orla has an outstanding record of innovative research. So she has published on a wide range of topics across clinical, health, political and social psychology. There are topics there around healthy eating, the Troubles, political conflict, youth and psychological well-being, citizenship, and empowering and disempowering experiences for groups celebrating Ireland's St. Patrick's Day, to name a few. And at one point in time, I was trying to convince Orla to extend her research on St. Patrick's Day to Australia, where of course there are many celebrations here as well that we could study. More recently, Orla has been awarded a highly competitive, prestigious, and sounds like a bit exhausting European Research Council Advanced Grant. So this is for leading researchers in Europe. It's a multi-million euro grant that focuses on the same themes that she's going to talk to us today about. So that project is focused on the search for the social contexts and conditions that facilitate successful adaptation to trauma. So Orla, we are very pleased that you're here to talk to us today, and we welcome you and we look forward to your talk.
Very much, Kate. Very generous introduction. I'm just going to show the slides here. But I feel like I need to do a disclaimer first that these are not my curtains. So I'm in a hotel bedroom, so I want to make it quite clear. I did not choose these curtains. They chose me. It is sometimes the little things that obsess me. So I'm going to talk today, as Kate said, about some of the work that we're doing here. I suppose I'll start by saying that the ERC grant has only started. In particular, when we get towards the end, I'll be very keen to hear what people have to say about some of the ideas, because we are really only getting off the ground. So the grant started on the 1st of January of this year, so we're early days. But it does build, and the idea of the ERC is that you get to build on things that you have done, but you're supposed to be making a kind of a leap forward, a new tack, if you like, or taking a new tack based on what you already know. So a lot of what I'm saying today is sort of the framing of that and how I got there. Really, because I'm a very bad audience member, this is the map of where we're going. So I often need to know, how much have I to get through here to survive the hour. So this is basically the outline of the talk and the outline of the idea around a social psychological basis for understanding trauma. So some of these things we can go through quite quickly because they're very easy to demonstrate, like for instance, why we need the model and why trauma is collective and those kinds of things. And then I'll try and get into some of the data that we have And this number 4 in particular, I suppose, which lies at the heart of what I'm trying to argue, that really traumatic experience can be identity creating. And I suppose that's, if I'm peddling an idea, that's probably the idea that I'm peddling today. So first of all, I think probably because the word trauma, certainly amongst my children, has moved into common parlance, they're very happy to tell me that I can traumatize them. You know, so, and I think we have all started to use trauma in that way. I think when I was a student, we used to talk about being depressed. When you were doing your PhD, you were depressed. But of course, you didn't mean you were clinically depressed. It was, again, a word that had moved into common parlance. And I think trauma has done that for you know, our times now. But I guess what I'm talking about is something that when you experience this, it has really important consequences, social, health, occupational functioning is interfered with. And PTSD in particular, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is something that is associated with quite a big global burden of disease. So this is a metric that is used to say, you know, how much damage is done by a particular health problem. So you can get global burden of disease on pancreatic cancer, you know, so you can get it on any health problem at all. And surprisingly for most people, PTSD is thought to result in the same number of years lost in terms of burden as schizophrenia, which of course is the problem that we mostly talk as being the major mental health problem. So psychological trauma and the experience of trauma really is an important mental health issue. But I think more than that, psychological trauma can contribute to all sorts of other things. So if we look, for instance, at what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, we can say, okay, here is a population that is going to have an extremely traumatic time in the period where we have this transition of government and change of government. And it's likely to impact on all sorts of things like family separation. We've seen the pictures already looking pretty awful, displacement of populations, migration, forced migration, potentially countries refusing to take refugees in. Well, I don't think that's potential. I think we all kind of expect that this kind of thing will happen. And therefore you get an erosion of trust between nations, between people and government. So it does have obvious political implications, and of course there is economic costs as well. So why is social psychology of trauma? Well, you don't really have to look very far to say, okay, there's something profoundly social about the nature of traumatic experiences. So the first thing is, in the old definition of PTSD, you couldn't get post-traumatic stress disorder unless you had what was called a criterion A experience. So it was the traumatic experience. Effectively, you had to have this experience before you could get PTSD. And if that is socially patterned, who experiences what in life is heavily socially patterned. I'm going to review that quickly in a minute. Sometimes people get PTSD even though the thing didn't happen to them. The traumatic experience was something that happened to somebody else and they witnessed it. So again, profoundly social. And then you can go into these bigger reviews, and there's some really wonderful reviews of the literature available on the nature of trauma. But one of the things that becomes clear in these reviews is that if you experience trauma, and it's something that was a purposeful human action that caused your trauma. So for instance, you're a victim, or a family member is a victim of homicide, or you're caught in political violence, or you're a victim of gender-based violence. That's a very different and has a very different outcome in terms of mental health compared to something that is considered accidental. So there seems to be something about the changing nature of how people view the world if they have been a victim of what is sometimes referred to as intentional violence. And many of the models of post-traumatic stress disorder talk about shattered assumptions of the world. But increasingly people are talking about what it does to people's understanding of the norms of human behavior if you're a victim of intentional human violence. So strong indicators that a social psychology of trauma is an important thing. So when I'm talking about trauma and when I'm using the word trauma, I suppose there are different definitions, but I'm using a definition that's really built on a model of stress where trauma is seen as a process. So there's this risk, which I refer to as the traumatic experience, not just me, but other people, but so it's been parceled out as the experience. Then there's this processing or integration that must occur if you've had a traumatic experience. And I think myself and Kate were probably having one of those conversations where we were trying to understand, so what's COVID like now in Australia, and what's COVID like in Ireland, what's COVID like? Every time I'm speaking to somebody from another country at the moment, I ask them, so what's COVID like in America? You know, have you got the Delta variant? What happens with, what's your vaccine uptake? You know, we're all trying to do this integration and understanding of what's going on. And then there's outcomes, and the outcomes of traumatic experiences will be affected by both the risk and the integration or the adaptation. It's not just the risk, it's this middle process part as well. And importantly, the outcome isn't always negative. Many people show resilience in the face of traumatic experience. So that's a really important part of understanding too. So when we talk about traumatic experience, and when I say that traumatic experience is patterned, there is this great site, if you don't know it, which you could lose hours of your life, called Our World in Data, where you can go in and get pictures of all sorts of things. So I have to stop myself, but here's some pictures that I took from Our World in Data. So this is the homicide rate. And as you can see, if you don't want to be killed in a random act of violence, be careful where you're born. You're doing quite well if you're living in Australia. And you're certainly doing quite well if you're living in Ireland, but I would strongly advise against moving to South America, possibly Central America. So we can see that national group membership has consequences for whether or not, and that's a pretty big traumatic experience to have somebody in your family a victim of homicide. And we can look at maternal deaths, and you can see similar, there's patterning, slightly different pattern. It's different countries now that are the high-risk countries. So again, you know, there is just national group membership is really important as to whether or not when you're born, you're going to have a mother available and in your life. And of course, that's a really chronic traumatic experience, because if your mother dies during childbirth, that isn't just an acute experience that is gone and you recover from. You never have your mother in your life, obviously. And then we have this child mortality rate, so rates of mortality in the under fives. And again, you can see all of this is patterned. And so big differences between nations, but actually in data that we have collected, and I started my life as a researcher in Northern Ireland, and very early on you can show, even in quite young children, that there is differences in the experiences that are linked to social group membership. So your category, whether it's in terms of social class, gender, or religion, because of course religion is a very salient division in Northern Ireland. Although clearly it isn't about religion, it's about a group marker or a group difference. That it's not only the amount of experience, but the type of experience you have. So there's an extent of experience and a nature of experience that seems to be linked here to just your social group membership. And then I suppose we're all, well now here's using trauma incorrectly, we're all traumatized by experiences with reviewers. So in a paper that we had where we argued that social group membership was relevant to traumatic experience, and we got a review back where the reviewers, this is probably going back 10 years ago, where the reviewers said that they bought our argument and they could see how it would be relevant to political violence, and they could see why what we were saying was true of the specific case of political violence, but they didn't think that social group membership was relevant to non-political traumatic experience. And in the, I suppose, I'm one of those people who gets very annoyed with the reviewer too, always. So off we went to collect data at the earliest opportunity on what was a non-political traumatic experience. And it just, by a whole series of coincidences, it ended up that we were in Nepal when the earthquakes happened in 2015. And in this paper, which I'll talk a little bit about again later, we demonstrated that actually the extent of your earthquake experience was entirely linked to the ethnic or caste group. So it's mostly caste groups in Nepal, even though the caste system is technically outdated and illegal in the country. But you could demonstrate quite easily that where you were positioned in the pecking order of caste affected the extent of your earthquake experiences and how extreme they were, with people at the bottom of the caste system, those showing the highest number of experiences. And of course, we all now know this COVID parable of we're all in the same storm, but these boats are very different. And certainly here in Ireland, one of the challenges of the last 6 months is that the mantra of everybody being in it together has started to fall apart. So even though we would have very high levels of social cohesion nationally, this issue of people understanding now that there's very patterned and very different experiences of what has been a traumatizing time for many is affected by group membership. And so if we think of post-traumatic stress disorder as something that is driven by risk, we can immediately see that the risk is driven by, for instance, national group membership. But even within nations, you find that there is different experiences that are linked to existing groups. And it tends to be the groups with the lowest levels of economic and social resources. So I suppose what you could generically say are the least powerful groups in society that tend to be those that have the most traumatic experience. And this, I suppose, in longer sort of theoretical papers that I've written with others, is why we argue that collective forces really are at the heart of understanding trauma, and there are qualitative and quantitative distinctions in what people experience because of their group membership. So effectively, the trauma risk tells us that the social is at the heart of what's going on. So if we go back to this idea of sort of how we think about or conceptualize trauma, this part of the first box of the risk we can see is social. If we talk now a little bit about the integration, I suppose there is, and this is a paper that I wrote with Tegan Cruz, who I know is there in ANU, amongst others. But if we think about this idea of integration, in this paper we try and theorize the relevance of social identities in particular to trauma. And one of the things that we argue in the paper is that traumatic experience is linked to gaining or losing identities. So if you think about a child who loses their mother, we often relabel the child as an orphan. If somebody loses if a husband loses their wife, they're labeled a widow. So we do actually have many examples in language. We also have examples where if a trauma occurs, we sometimes don't even label it. It's almost, as Kevin Durkheim would say, an unspeakable. So in English, we don't have a word for somebody who loses a child. But strangely, in the Irish language, we do. And in the Arab languages, there is a word for somebody who loses a child. But it's kind of an unspeakable trauma, nearly in English, to talk about being, talk about a parent that's bereaved. And then I guess the other thing is that traumatic experiences make identities relevant. And I just have a little picture here of Belfast. So this is what is known colloquially in Ireland as the peace line. So I think only in the context of the Northern Irish Troubles can you get something that is built to divide two communities being called a peace line without any sense of irony. So this is the Catholic side of the peace line. And as somebody who is from the Republic of Ireland and was brought up Catholic, even I found it quite stressful to walk up that side of the road. So I can't imagine how that would feel for somebody who was, for instance, of a Protestant background or who was English to walk up that side of the road. I wouldn't, certainly at night, think about walking along the peace line on the other side of the wall. So there are very many, and I guess a very dramatic example, but there are ways in which experiences make identity relevant. And in situations like political violence, it's really easy to see. But we argue that it's not just in those situations. So I have two examples here. One is qualitative data, and this is a quote from a paper in the European Journal of Social Psychology, and it's it's a woman who was a police officer who had an acquired brain injury. And she basically articulates how she lost her occupational identity. And with that, she lost all of the group that came with that occupational identity. And then she articulates in the end the acquisition of a new stigmatized identity. You know, people are going to be scared that she's somebody that's going to sit in the corner and dribble, so that she's reconstructed as somebody with a brain injury, which is problematic. And then the other example is an example where you can see that once you start asking people about what they have experienced over the course of the Troubles, you find that those with more experience tend to cling more to their national and religious group memberships. So here, this is a complicated model that has, and probably not that easy to, not that available in terms of, you know, the visual presentation. But what we showed in this paper was that when you look at a representative sample of people in Northern Ireland, you can show that there are different classes of traumatic experience, that different groups of people have different types of traumatic experience. So we would say that the model that we're showing here is not unlike Nyla Branscom's idea of rejection identification, that when there's high level of threat in a society, that people identify more, and that identification offers a trade-off that it can protect your mental health. So even though the threat is high, because I cling to my group, I can feel better, and that mitigate some of the worst excesses of the feelings of threat. But when we looked at the different classes of responses to people's experience of violence, what you find is that this model really only holds for those with high experience of trauma. That there is a group that was largely Catholic that had high experience of trauma, and the model held very well. There was a second group that had high indirect experience of trauma, and it looked like the model was a reasonable fit. Overall, it's a reasonable fit. But the reality is that whether or not this process of increased identification occurs is a lot to do with, so it's the integration is a combination of the identification and the traumatic experience, not just the traumatic experience or not just the identification. And then just to remind people where the social identity approach came from, of course, it came from a place that was trying to tell you about intergroup attitudes. It was all, Tadgefeld was all about explaining genocide to us. It wasn't originally so much about health, that's a latter development. So in this data, so this is work with a group in Israel. So we're looking at, we combined the Northern Irish data with a data set from people who live in Israel and Palestine. And what you find is that, so this here, post-traumatic stress symptoms really is a measure of PTSD. This is how much political violence people have been exposed to. And what you find is that there is this strange thing going on, and not so strange if you think about it in a social identity way, that yes, it's experience of violence is driving symptoms, But symptoms are also increasing people's level of threat. And these things are affecting political outcomes. It has consequence for whether or not people feel they're able to engage with peace. And of course, experience of political violence is socially patterned, and perceived threat is socially patterned. So in fact, what you find when you compare the Northern Irish sample to the Israeli-Palestine sample is that the ongoing violence is also affecting perceived threat. So in a second paper, we looked at that. So it's just to remember that this amplification of social identification has important socio-political consequences. Which brings me to sort of where we are now and what we're trying to do on the outcomes. So of course, if we think that social identity loss can be damaging, well then you are offered the possibility that social identity gain could help adaptation. So life can be funny, and you end up in Nepal, you're supposed to be studying political violence, there's an earthquake, you end up studying earthquakes, then you realize that somebody who lives in Limerick has been working in Nepal with people who have leprosy for many years, and they think that you know something about Nepal and you don't, and they ask you to get involved in a project, and then they realize all you really knew anything about was trauma. But it transpires that people who are diagnosed with leprosy in Nepal are very stigmatized in the way that it has, you know, the biblical connotation of leper, and it is still a really, so people are cast out still from their communities if they have a diagnosis of leprosy. So it is really a very difficult diagnosis for people, a very traumatic experience to have it in your family, very traumatic experience as a very difficult thing to adapt to in communities that are already extremely poor, disempowered, marginal. And this particular agency that I ended up engaged with, they have this, they're trying this self-help group approach with funding from Irish Aid. So this is a self-help group in the picture, and they're trying to teach self-care and health literacy and teaching people how to manage their leprosy themselves. But a key thing is they're with other people. So normally people who've been diagnosed with leprosy in Nepal wouldn't necessarily be in groups. They would be, they might not even be able to stay in their own homes. So forced displacement and exclusion from families. So we have been trying to look at the impact of this self-help group engagement on people who've been diagnosed with leprosy. So this is the nice, easy models where we, you know, where I show you the picture. The picture is straightforward, and it shows, you know, the stats aren't here. This was a postdoc who did this slide. It's much easier to read than all the stats, but I do have the stats on another side. But what we show is that this, what's shown in the data is that this participation in self-help groups allows access to multiple groups and social participation, and lo and behold, you find reduced stigmatization and increased well-being. And in 2 or 3 papers now, we argue that this group-based intervention is really flattening the symptoms that people have in terms of psychological well-being and PTSD. And one of the things that we think is going on is that people are increasing their health literacy because they're motivated to attend the self-help group. So their health literacy is going up, and when their health literacy goes up, they realize that all these stereotypes that they're being exposed to isn't necessarily, or they're not necessarily useful or helpful stereotypes. And that's reducing stigma-related self-harm. And the next phase of the project is, because the charity has gotten more funding from Irish Aid, is trying to put in little micro economies, so that as well as getting health literacy, people will now get kind of economic literacy and under, you know, development of co-ops and chickens and, you know, things that they can have to develop communities where people who have leprosy are part of that community. So that new initiative in the charity parlance is called Village Alive project. So there'll be more on that hopefully in years to come. So when we think about the sort of social identity ideas, you know, we are all very familiar with categorization, identification, comparison. And sometimes I think people who engage with the social identity approach forget that all of this is framed by privilege and power, and we might, because we might be taking an experimental approach, maybe we're manipulating status or power. But of course, one of the things about traumatic experience that we know, because it's a collective phenomenon and it's patterned, is that there is this huge issue about who has the traumatic experience, and they tend to be those who are least powerful, least privileged. And sometimes the majority group isn't entirely aware of their privilege. So there's kind of, as Billy would say, a banality to the privilege. So we draw on these ideas of mindless majorities and mindful minorities. So the mindful minorities are aware of their identities and their useful psychological resources. But the mindless majorities, we may not be seeing the effects because they're not necessarily understanding the identification, or the identification is invisible to them because of this banality. And in the longer position paper in Advances, we argue that this gives rise to all sorts of misunderstandings. And if you don't know what I mean, you could probably go on Twitter and look at anything in relation to Black Lives Matter or Me Too to see the development of those kinds of misunderstanding. I don't know if you have you Love Island in Australia? Do you know the TV show? No? Has it made it there?
Yeah, well, yes, we do have it, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, very important viewing here. So it's especially in lockdown. So Love Island finished yesterday in the UK. And, you know, much triumph, people delighted with the winners. But it took, I'd say, about 2 minutes before somebody pointed out the shadism in who came first, second, third, fourth. So who came first was 2 white people. Who came second was a mixed race and a white person. Who came third was a mixed race and a mixed race. And who came fourth were 2 black people. And immediately this is pointed out, you get one group saying, oh, why are you talking about race? This is ridiculous. And the other group on Twitter saying, here's another example of how black people have to work harder. And why did these 2 win? They weren't even faithful to each other. I'm spending far too much time watching Love Island, but at the moment, it's about the only way I can have a conversation with my children where we don't argue. So it's reasonably useful for that purpose. So I'm going to finish with this, and this is the sort of, this is the paper at the moment that I suppose it's just been submitted, and it's kind of the newest data that we've been looking at, and it's where we're trying to look at, so there is a literature out there already that says that there is this thing called individual post-traumatic growth, so that when people have a traumatic experience, that they can actually develop, rather than resilience, they can actually develop and have psychological growth as a consequence. So they begin to be wiser, or they see the value of others more, or they sometimes report greater spiritualism. But they're positive consequences. So it is a thriving and a flourishing as a consequence of trauma, not just resilience. So we had in the earthquake study shown that where you had amplification of social identity, you could see increased post-traumatic growth. But as time went on, and particularly the year I spent in Brisbane, and we were thinking about these issues more, and in the ERC grant, we argued that there is likely to be something called collective post-traumatic growth. So these 4 women are pretty inspirational women. The first woman here, Lavinia Kerwick, so they're all Irish women. And in Ireland, and I think it might be the same in Australia, when a charge of rape is taken and a conviction is secured, women are entitled to anonymity. So their anonymity is protected subsequent to the trial completing. And mostly because it's thought to be stigmatizing for women to be identified as victims of rape. So in the history of the state, there has been 4 women who have waived their anonymity. So by definition, if you accept that the reason they have anonymity is to protect them from stigmatization, by definition, if they waive it, there must be a personal cost. So if you're trying to distinguish individual post-traumatic growth from collective post-traumatic growth, it's likely that the waiving this is going to increase personal distress for women. So there must be some other reason other than a personal reason for them to do this. So these 4 women waive anonymity, and they end up being kind of, I suppose, interviewed on countless radio stations. Many of them have written articles for newspapers. So we got everything that we could that they have written, and we subjected it to a qualitative analysis. Lavinia Kerwick, the woman at the top on the left, was the first person to do it. And I remember it like a flashbulb. It was in the, it was a long time ago, it was in the late 80s. So she was raped by her then boyfriend, who arrived at the scene prepared, gagged her, bound her, and repeatedly raped her. At the time, the scandal was the local priest stood up at the trial and said he was a lovely boy, he played Gaelic football, and it was hard to believe, and he got a suspended sentence. So the trial having been delayed for over a year, he got a non-custodial sentence for a very vicious and planned rape. So she was the first person who spoke out. And the other 3 women have spoken out for various reasons. The second woman was a solicitor, and she said that she was more traumatized by the court system than the rape that she experienced, a man who broke into her house who she didn't know, so a classic stranger rape. And as a solicitor, she said she couldn't believe how appalling the court system was. So she spoke out about the court system. The next woman spoke out because she felt that there was a community that wasn't being minded, that was a gay, so she was a member of the gaming community, and she felt women were being placed at risk within the gaming community. She spoke out for that reason. And the last woman spoke out because of issues of shame and stigma, and she felt that it was ridiculous, the amount of shame and stigma that people were being subjected to. So I have some quotes to try and demonstrate to you that out there in the wild, there does seem to be this thing called collective post-traumatic growth that isn't about me becoming a better person, but actually here is somebody, and this is Niamh Donald, so the girl who wanted to destigmatize rape. So she says it's very heartening that people are speaking about rape. So it's not about her speaking about rape. She started a conversation. People are speaking about rape. And it's a topic that a lot of us, so she isn't speaking in the personal, and that's sort of, in discursive psychology, that's a classic indicator that she has moved from the personal to collective. So that there's this topic that a lot of us tend to avoid. So she thinks that there's a lot of positives. Now, earlier in many interviews, she talks about how horrendous it has been to speak out, but there's a lot of positives that don't necessarily, that's not necessarily been a not particularly nice situation, but that has been an unexpected outcome for us, not for her. So it does look like something collective. And then this is Lavinia Kerwick, so the first woman who spoke out. And I think this is a conversation with so the radio interviewer is Ray Darcy, and he's asking her, so do you still think the court case was as bad as the rape? And he then says, well, if you say that, and classic sort of ideological dilemma, as Billy would say, that, do you not think if you say that people won't come forward? And then she uses a trope that's used in Ireland of the land of the 1,000 welcomes. So the tourist board love using this kind of, because it comes from an Irish phrase, Céad Míle Fáilte, so land of the 1,000 welcomes. And she says, do you want us to be known as the land of the 1,000 rapes? So she actually harnesses the collective identity and the collective understanding using this trope to recreate this appalling vista of a land of 1,000 rapes. So what you see here is women who have had traumatic experiences drawing on the collective, and indeed in many of the interviews they talk about how they felt the responsibility to speak for the collective. So these were just ordinary women who had terrible experience, and it really is quite inspirational. You could get quite teary about it all when you're reading these interviews that they have. So they have completely changed. So I guess what I'm arguing for is this sort of move away from the primacy of the individualist psychology of trauma. And I think that gets away from, as well as a model that isn't necessarily working for people, it gets away from this pathologization of people. So instead of it being about, the people are the problem, let's fix the people with the PTSD, there's something wrong in the world. And I think for many of us, certainly in Ireland, we can do that very easily when we think of school shooters in the States. You look and you say, well, why don't you just take the guns out of the equation? It isn't about the pathology of the individual. If you just took the guns out of the equation, so it's clearly a context. And I'm sure it's very easy for you when you sit and look at our lovely peace lines to say, okay, that's weird. You really shouldn't be living your lives with big walls and calling that peace. But of course, to people who live in Belfast, that's what a peace line is. So, we routinely do this thing where we think about the person who has had the traumatic experience as the problem, but actually we can very quickly show that it is the context that's the problem. And often in these women, when they're interviewed, what they're highlighting is the context that's the problem. They're highlighting all of the issues in the system that are giving rise to rape and non-prosecution and non-conviction of men who have raped women as the problem. So at the heart of it all is this sort of agency and attribution and inequality. And this one, as Kate said earlier on, I'm prone to running, and this is something that we included in the political psychology paper, the advances paper, because it really annoys me so much. This is a campaign that was used in the UK for women. Well, it was technically for runners, but it was mostly targeted at women runners about how to protect themselves. And if we take a social representation approach, what exactly are we saying in this? There's a line on the piece of information. It says, "Be alert but not worried." Okay, that we talk about in PTSD studies about controlling for gender. You cannot control for gender when it comes to PTSD if our advice for women when they're in public spaces is to be alert but not worried. Like a symptom of PTSD is being over alert. The manner in which we are thinking about trauma needs to embed these identities into, not control them out, not think about things as something that has to be a demographic that has to be controlled for. The experience of street harassment is powerfully related to group identities. So this social psychological model of trauma, since the very inception of the diagnosis of PTSD, it has been controversial. It appeared into the DSM with, a political push, and there was controversy. If we move away from, now obviously getting the label, and it's really clear, getting the label in any diagnosis will get you support and treatment. But of course, getting the label can then mean that you're stigmatized. So we're in this zone of, do you want to be called a victim? But if we move away from seeing traumatic consequences as being a product of somehow the person, we begin to pay attention to what it is about context that's so problematic. And traumatic experiences and the contexts that give rise to them are often very political. In our modern world, it's often to do with disempowerment and dispossession. And then diagnosis can act to further undermine people's autonomy. So you take away agency. So in the interviews with the women, what we see them talking about is the need for them to assert their agency. They explicitly say things like they're taking their identity back, they're taking the control back, that they're not going to be defined by the man that raped them. Sometimes that taking away of autonomy, Pupovac argues, is done because we're trying actually to take, you're using it as a justification to take autonomy away from people. And certainly in the ad that the police offer, there is some evidence that what's been suggested is, if you need help, if you need to deal with that, you come to us. You know, there is a justification for intervention rather than trying to stop the trauma per se. And I think then the other thing is that, and this is a picture of, it's an area around the university in Queens, that sometimes what we think is traumatic experience isn't necessarily traumatic experience, because of course PTSD was about an acute event that happened over there. You know, that was how the diagnosis was originally thought about. But for some people, that's just life. You know, and again, if we think of Afghanistan and what's going on, it is life. It's not just a discrete experience. So the context really is very important to the whole business. So where we're at now with the work is that we're thinking about social identity change as being at the heart of the process, whether it's maintaining identities or gaining or losing identities, but thinking about how the change in identities can actually be as much a part of the trauma process as anything else. And one of the things that we're now moving to look at, and of course is a big scandal here, I know it has affected Australia to a degree, but it's a huge issue here, is the issue of mother and baby homes and the separation because of perceived illegitimacy of children, and people who are separated from parents, children separated from mothers. And we've started to look at the impact of that and how that it really, the social identity elements are at the heart of the responses and the mental health responses that people have. So the sort of change in connection, change in definition of social self that went with being put into a home for a fallen woman, as the homes were at the time, and how that bred social isolation that really people never got over. And here's a little poem, which is only the end section of it, but I really like the poem because I love the last line. So it's a poem about the 1916 Rising, and the which is commonly associated with the birth of the Irish state. And Yeats uses this phrase of, you know, wherever green is worn, that you'll be changed utterly, and this notion of a terrible beauty. And to me, that is this idea of collective growth. And where we're going next, I suppose, with is not only the idea that I could have growth in my social identity as a consequence of traumatic experience, but we hope in the future to look at whether or not you could have growth in the collective. Because to me, much of the story of modern Ireland is a story of traumatic experience that has resulted in growth in collective, with things like marriage equality and abortion access arising out of sort of a traumatic history. So I think that the idea of the terrible beauty that there can be, and like, I'm obviously not encouraging people to go out and have traumatic experiences, but I think that there can be growth in the collective as well as growth in my collective identities, if you like. Okay, how am I doing on time? Went on too long. Sorry.
No, thanks. All of that is wonderful. So we have got time for questions. I mean, you know, you've taken us through, you know, a whole kind of trajectory of ideas there. So we see, you know, on show the naturalistic samples, the mixed methods, you know, the innovative directions of work, the poetry. So, you know, you really have offered us a lot in that talk. So I don't think I've got the question buttons, but maybe I do, but Erin will if I don't. But I did want to start, you know, obviously, you know, I have a lot of sympathy with the arguments, the trajectory of ideas, and the importance of groups and group connections to all of these kind of wellbeing outcomes. But I did want to, as you were talking, I was just thinking, well, why you talk about the DSM, you talk about PSTD, why would the same analysis not apply to anxiety or depression or a whole range of other, dimensions that presumably also are patterned and are connected probably to trauma or disadvantage or hardship, resources, all of those things? I mean, is there anything, I guess the question is there anything specific here about PTSD and trauma that you think bounds the analysis, or do you think it does have a more general applicability? And obviously, we know there's work on depression, for example, but would you make a stronger case for all of those psychological mental disorder classifications?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing I'd say is that yes, so some of the consequences of traumatic experience will be seen in relation to depression, or will be seen in relation to, say, eating disorders. So yes, absolutely. So traumatic experience can have outcomes other than PTSD. So yes, some of the argument applies. Mm-hmm. But I guess what I do, where I would sort of dig in a little bit, is say that what people tend to do when they think about that is that they don't allow for really how traumatic experience defines groups. So my traumatic experience can define me as a refugee, which is actually so it is profoundly linked in a way that I don't think applies in another example. So it can define me as a group member, or my group membership can be defined by my risk, like in the case of women and rape. So I think that there is something really, it is so intrinsically linked, and it's like one of the things that we're really bad at is predicting who gets PTSD. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I think we're really bad at that is because we keep controlling out the identity piece. Mm-hmm. And to me, actually, traumatic experience is traumatic experience is identity defining, social identity defining, not personal. Now there are other people saying it's which defines personal identity, but I think it profoundly defines your social identities, the content of your social identities.
Okay, we have a range of questions here. So Tegan, did you want to ask a question, or is it more of a comment? And then there's another one in chat. Ian has a question as well. So
okay.
Tegan, Ian, and then in chat.
Oh, I see.
We need to
Tegan, you're on, and then Ian.
No, thank you. Just waiting to get the mute off. Orla, thank you so much. That was delightful as always, and really important and interesting. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that I agree with everything you're saying. My question's a bit bigger picture for you, and I'm not sure if there's really any literature that speaks to this, but it's something I've been preparing the last week or so for some lecture content I delivered this morning, which was around intergenerational trauma. And I guess that's an area that I think you touched on at the end that I'm not sure social identity has really had a lot to say about yet empirically, about how intergenerational trauma works and how that kind of plays out across multiple generations. But I wondered if you wanted to expand on how you see social identity as relevant in that space.
Yeah, I do see it as relevant, and there is, so the data I'll always know best, of course, the Irish data, so I'll know the Northern Irish data sets around attitudes are beginning to show that the next generation, so what would be the peacetime babies, actually have more dug in social attitudes. So they're actually more entrenched. And one of the things that we know is that witnessing trauma, even if it is that it's a witnessing of parents, obviously you didn't witness it, but you're witnessing sort of, or certainly alive to the experiences that your parents have had. that seems to have a consequence for next generation. So I do think that there is, again, it speaks to this sort of social psychological foundations of trauma. There is work coming out of Israel that's suggesting that it's altering paths of communication, and particularly parents and children tend to have more emotional conversations. So I do think it's relevant, but as you correctly say, the data just isn't there yet to tell us exactly what's going on. But I would argue that family is an important social identity group. So yeah, I'm not a very good answer, Tegan, but I think it's the process.
I think it is as good as an answer as we can get on the current data. So no, thank you. And area for more work, I think, very interesting.
Will I answer this question in the chat, Kate?
Erin, who was next?
Yes, I think we've got a question in the Q&A, and then Ian's unmuted. So maybe we could go to Ian and then go to the question in the Q&A.
Great. Ian.
Okay, thanks, Kate, and thanks, Erin, and thank you very much, Orla, for a wonderful talk. I don't mind the curtains too much, but I'm a long way removed from them. So my question picks up a lot from Tegan's and is an invitation maybe to be more speculative rather than talk about what the data say. And if I can go back to the last slide, the Yeats poem, and a terrible beauty is born. So in the context, especially of Australia's, and there is some emerging work on intergenerational trauma, especially around stolen generations that have afflicted decades and decades of Indigenous families. A question, an invitation to speculate, and it's totally unfair given you've maybe not even spent a whole year in Australia, is if you could imagine being a midwife at the birth of a terrible beauty, looking forward, how can you better manage or better secure the emergence of a terrible beauty rather than just a terror? How as psychologists, as theorists, people like Tegan, practitioners, clinicians, how can you take such an awful, indescribable, protracted state intervention against a group of people and try to maybe give advice or help politically engage in political activism to try to encourage the birth of a terrible beauty out of that trauma?
Yeah, I feel, well, I feel your pain there, and I feel that certainly in Ireland we have similar issues arising, and I think so an awful lot of the terrible element in Ireland is to do with the position of women in Irish society historically, and some of the some of the issues around the mother and baby homes and those types of issues arose because of how women were positioned. So I think the way that you end up with a terrible, and what I suppose where I'm going with it, and what has happened during COVID is that there has been, in Ireland, but I know internationally, there has been steps backwards in terms of women's power and people listening to women's voices. So we still have an ongoing battle here where women aren't allowed to have their partners in hospitals with them as they give birth. But we had 40,000 people attend a GAA match on Sunday. So there is, so Gaelic football, largely male dominated interest. So those kinds of issues come back, when there's a fault line. And to me, the way that I have been advocating that, you get the beauty rather than the terror is that the voices of the dispossessed and the disempowered as I would say, the position of women in Irish society has completely and radically altered since my mother's generation compared to my daughter's generation. So I do think that there has been incredible change in terms of the social position. And I think then what you'd be talking about in Australia would be changing the social position of Indigenous populations, but also that they would have power, that they would be represented in the conversations, that they would influence how things would be organised into the future. So one of the reasons that the COVID has raised so many issues around the position of women in Irish society is because there has been a male COVID cabinet COVID committee where they kept making stupid mistakes because they didn't have women's voices around the table. So they were making mistakes about how people would deal with schooling and childcare and all these issues that were relevant. So to me, the way to deal with it is a kind of with an eye to social justice and allowing people voice and participation. And I don't mean a token Indigenous person on a committee. I mean that, people are at the cabinet table, that they that some of the inequality that led to these issues are corrected, and of course that makes it hugely political.
Thank you. It can't be anything but political, and in this country we saw it play out, I guess, pointedly with the Bring Them Home Royal Commission, which was a state-sanctioned public acknowledgement of those experiences. And we saw it play out, especially around the then Prime Minister John Howard's inability or unwillingness to just say sorry. And then when that formal apology was was given by Kevin Rudd in his first speech in Parliament, it was enormously powerful. But the power of that symbolic change, I think, arguably has waned a lot, precisely because there haven't been those positional structural changes since. Anyway, enough from me. Thank you, Orla.
So then we have a comment in chat. So is that Lego? Is that Erin? Is that the comment, or?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a question there from Lego.
So it seems like most of the change of social identity that contributes to trauma has been a downgrade of identity. What are your thoughts or research on identity shifts that are upward or horizontal?
Yeah, so we have a couple of studies where we look at identity shifts that are upwards. So it's certainly upward shifts seem to protect, and increased group membership seems to protect. So the work we've done with people with brain injury in particular, adding groups, having more groups after the injury appears to protect people who have acquired a traumatic brain injury. So yes, I would say that there are two ways. One is in sort of number, one is in strength of identification, and then there is this issue of is the identity positive or negative? So you can gain an identity, but if the identity you gain is rape victim, might not be very useful to you. So it is also about the content of that. So it's like gaining the identity of leper isn't particularly a useful gain. So I think there's an awful lot around what is the gain. But there is, a gain of a positive identity or consolidation of a positive identity. Yes, it appears to promote resilience. And it's really important to remember that the most common outcome of traumatic experience is resilience.
Okay, well, there's a lot there to think about. I was thinking about the not just resilience, but thriving and flourishing, as a message here. And there's also something deep in maybe the normative context that sort of tell us that we should, I don't know whether it's a religious kind of overtone of some form, but that we should benefit from hardship somehow, or I don't know, there's a normative element to all of that as well, which is coming to the fore. But Orla, we are over time, but I wanted to thank you again. Fascinating work. Clear and impressive talk. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can touch base with you again and hear more about how the work develops. So thank you, and you've got lots of connections here at ANU, so when all of this COVID world and travel is back on the table, hopefully we can organise to have you join us in person. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, everyone.